First of all, if you are a dearly loved son of your mother, nothing can stop you.
And that's when you have to. I always say, like, it's the only way you can be truly authentic is if you're willing to share with other people what you're asking them to share with you.
What he found was that he could be loved by someone, Jesus. And that the experience of knowing that being capable of seeing yourself as lovable is a huge achievement that I don't know you can get to. You just...
Howdy. I'm Hannah Newitt-Schwander, a production lead at a soybean seed facility in Central Illinois, and you're listening to the Vance Crow Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today is a big day for me. We are sitting down with Dr. Elizabeth Stone, who wrote a book called Black Sheep and Kissing Cousins that I read in college. This book had a huge impact on me because I started to see the true power of family stories. And I can tell you that for many years, as I traveled around the country doing different work, even abroad as a deckhand and living in Africa, I took that book with me everywhere I went. Because one of the things I found is that everybody has family stories to tell. And when you can get somebody to open up and talk about their family stories, you get let in not only on their culture and on the place that they came from, but really who they are as an individual, what their values are, what they care about, and what they hope gets passed on into the future. That's why Dr. Stone is such a great guest for me, because longtime listeners of the podcast know that I do legacy interviews where I sit in this studio or I do them online, and I sit down with individuals and couples to record them telling their family stories so that future generations know their family history and the values they want passed down. If you're interested in having me sit down with your family, go check out our brand new website at www.legacyinterviews.com. All right, without further ado, let's head to the interview with Elizabeth Stone. Elizabeth Stone, welcome to the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. I'm copying down your website.
Oh, that's great. So it is such a big day for me that I get to sit down and talk with you. I read your book. I've carried your book around for so many years. And so the first question I have out of the gate is, why write a book on family stories in the way that you did?
It began with an article I did for the New York Times long ago when people still associated Italians with the mafia. I think they don't anymore. And so the article was called, It's Still Hard to Grow Up Italian. And what I realized is that although my grandparents were demographically, there were certain expectations from Southern Italians, what they weren't going to do and what they weren't going to be. But my family was very different. In my mother's generation, and we're talking about the 19-teens then, my grandparents had 6 children. One became a painter, one became a novelist. My mother was an actor, and one went into business and shortened his first name so it didn't sound Italian. And so what I realized was I didn't know why my family was so different from what the demographic expectations were. And so I started thinking about the stories I'd heard, which, my grandmother lived in Brooklyn. All her 6 children, 4 of them lived in Brooklyn, and 2 of them lived very close by in Long Island. And so there were very large family gatherings on every conceivable holiday, but not Saints' days. And stories just sort of. And so what I realized was in my family, what I was very aware of, and I should make one aside, which was that when World War II came, my grandmother was required to sign up as an enemy alien, even though she had one son in the Navy and another son in the Army. And the reason for this was because Mussolini was the enemy. And that was incredibly humiliating to her and to the whole family. And it became almost a symbol of the denigration of Italians during the first half of the 20th century. And those stories stayed with me, but what I saw were a lot of protective stories that, intentionally or not, diminished the power of the negative world that was just outside the front door. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, had run off. He had been a postman, or so the story went, and he fell in love with the wealthy landowner's daughter. He was a very talented postman because he could play any musical instrument he laid his hands on. And so I had this image of her running off with him in the night wearing a shift. I didn't know what a shift was, but I thought it was very romantic. And they went off and had their dozen children. And the story was that at night, he and his sons would gather in the town square, and they would have all their musical instruments with them, and they would play. And the villagers would be frozen in their tracks with admiration. Then there was another story about my grandmother's beautiful singing voice, and she did have a beautiful singing voice. And the story was that she would be singing, and the parish priest would walk by, and the story was that my grandmother would say, "Be quiet." My great-grandmother would say, "Be quiet, be quiet. The padre will want us to send you to Rome for singing lessons." So the idea in the family was that money wasn't really important. Nobody ever talked about money, but that the arts were really remarkably important. And my mother had a brief career on Broadway, and my uncle published 2 novels, maybe more. And so the idea was that accomplishment was important, and it was fueled by the idea, real or imagined, of these ancestors who gave them, who weren't celebrities, who weren't famous people, but it was in their blood. And so they could go forth and they could do what they wanted to do in this country, even become artists. And those were very protective stories. So based on that and a few more, I mean, one of the stories, just to show you that there was some element of truth in it, after my book on family stories came out, there had been another music story, and it was my mother and her 5 brothers and sisters lived above a grocery store, and my grandmother would have to clean the stairs, or she did clean the stairs that led up to their apartment. And the story was that Mr. Peterson, there goes one of my AirPods, that Mr. Peterson would stop whatever he was doing and say, "Be quiet, be quiet. I have to listen to the woman upstairs sing." And I sort of rolled my eyes at that. But when the book came out, I wrote a piece for the Times again about some of the family stories, and actually got a letter from Mr. Peterson's daughter saying that was not an apocryphal story. It was a true story. She remembered my grandmother. She remembered her singing opera. And so the mixture, whether everybody in the town square was frozen and all the sons played different instruments, who knows? But there was enough of a germ of truth there that we all bought into, and that was inspirational.
Yeah, the thing you said at the beginning of that, where your grandmother was so horrified by the fact that she had to register as an illegal alien, or an enemy of the state, or whatever it was,
alien.
The stories were allowed to push the outside world away, and they got to define who they were. That's such an important concept, because it allows families to be able to pass down, this is who we are, and kind of what matters to us. Did you know that going into these stories? Like, when did you come to these conclusions about stories?
Oh, not for a long time. I mean, nobody thinks about these stories, but I do want to say one thing, is that the story about how my grandmother had to sign up as an enemy alien was enormously painful. That went through the decades as much as all the sunnier stories. And so the story, she did have to register as an enemy alien in the early 40s, which was long before I was born. And shoot forward to beyond the into the 21st century, when she had a grown great-granddaughter that she'd never met. She died in 1973, and now we were in, 2015. And at Ellis Island, there are ship manifests and all the names of all the people who came on particular shifts. And so my young cousin, spent a lot of time looking up to see if she could find my grandmother. The earlier story was that the reason my grandmother had to sign as an enemy alien is because she couldn't prove that she had come here legally. Now, in those days, there were no green cards and there were no visas, but the proof was, were you on a ship manifest? Could you prove that you had gone through Ellis Island? And at a certain point, my young cousin solved the mystery. A mystery that went from 1905, a full century, to 2015. It turned out her last name was Bongiorno, Bongiorno. Her first name was Annunziata, and I am not sure that I can spell it, but I think there are a number of N's, a T or two. At any rate, her name had been misspelled on the ship manifest. And so even though my uncles went down to wherever you're supposed to go down to find the manifests then on paper and prove, they couldn't find her on the manifests. And of course they couldn't with her misspelled name. So a century later, my young cousin solved the mystery that had put my grandmother in a very bad light and caused her to sign up as an enemy, forced her to sign up as an enemy alien.
When your family was passing down that story of her being, an illegal alien, or what was the value that they were trying to tell? What were they trying to communicate?
I think that they were humiliated by it. And what I bet goes on now is, we have, certainly immigration is an issue. And I very much am curious about the kinds of storytelling that goes on in those families. And let's hope that in every family, green card or not, the stories are not damaging to the younger generation. The stories are giving them tools to help them cope with the ways in which they are unwelcome.
Yeah, I think that I've definitely heard one of the core questions I ask early on in an interview, if people know about their family history. Sometimes they don't know where their ancestors came from, but I often ask, do you know what made them come, right? Do you know why they left Ireland, or do you know why they left Italy? And when they do, there's often some kind of embedded lesson in there. Oh, their all of their property had been nationalized, and so they had a small factory, and they had to leave, and they would rather be housekeepers in the new world than people that had been stolen from in the old world. And you hear these stories and you hear them passed down. And for me, it's oftentimes, I think, a lesson about, watch what can happen to you. Your family is, if you have to leave, better to leave with pride in the work you're doing. And I think that I would never have been able to decipher that without your book, which I mentioned in the beginning is called Black Sheep and Kissing Cousins. Where did that title come from?
I do mention, I saw, because I was looking at it this morning. I haven't read it in a long time, but I do reference black sheep in the book. And one day I was talking to my editor, and this is true. I know it to be true. My grandfather and his two sisters were first cousins of my grandmother and her two brothers. And hence kissing cousins, because all the two brothers and a sister married the two sisters and a brother, and they all came to the United States together, and none of them had to change their names. Because the two brothers who were their parents were both Bongiornos.
And in the book, you talk about black sheep stories and the value of telling about, different members of your family that are black sheep. Can you kind of describe what is a black sheep and why people tell these stories?
There are two kinds of black sheeps. The kind that that people like and that appear in the stories tend to be the sort of bad boys that American culture makes heroes of, like Bonnie and Clyde or Johnny Appleseed, or so the really real, I didn't find out till, I don't know, the day before yesterday, that there was one family member in my family who was a mafia member. Never heard about him. They never talked about him. So the black sheep are the ones that got away, the larger than life folks. Someone who could hold their liquor, someone who had 6 marriages, someone who climbed, well, there was one story about this sort of rebel grandmother who climbed Mount Everest or some large mountain when she was in her 80s. Now, she wasn't a black sheep, but she was considered foolish. And one of the uses of that story by her granddaughter, the granddaughter was a very compliant young woman, or she had been. The story that was told about her as a baby was they didn't even have to put her in a playpen because she would just sit on the mat. And who you're told you are can be to some degree who you become. And she hated how she had always been seen as the one who didn't even need a playpen because she would just be immobile on the mat. Her grandmother was an inspiration to her. And she, when she was in her 20s and 30s, she refashioned that story so that she felt entitled to some of that bravery.
I love that. It felt entitled to the bravery, like this is where you come from. And I mean, that's one of the most important parts of family stories, right? The kids that know where they came from, and the research is showing, even if you are in an adopted situation where you are an adopted child coming into a family, knowing your adopted family's story oftentimes keeps you from having depression and anxiety and drug use, because people need to be able to draw inspiration. This is who our people are, and this is what we do.
I don't know that I spoke to any adopted people for the book, but I have later heard, and maybe DNA makes this kind of curiosity possible, is that, and I actually said this in the book, that not to know where you come from genetically is to have a little bit of amnesia, because we have our own lives. But if we don't know our ancestral lives, yes, we know who our parents are, our adoptive parents, and we love them, and we think that they are our mothers and fathers. And there's a little bit of guilt at the curiosity that remains. But that curiosity seems now, because there's another kind of family story that your doctor reads every time you go to the doctor, and that's your medical chart. Your medical chart is a kind of family story. What diseases did your parents have? What diseases did your when did they die? And so those kinds of family stories are now increasingly part of people's own family stories.
So you mentioned there were 2 kinds of black sheep, the one that's the rebel and kind of the one to look up to. What's the other kind?
The one like my mafia relative who nobody talks about. I don't think, look, it certainly was a catchy title, and I didn't have to put a little asterisk that said good black sheep, not bad black sheep on the book title. But there really were, the real black sheep were generally people who abandoned the family. And so they were alluded to, and then there was the sound of the door slamming behind them. They were not included.
So as you did all of this research into your own life, into the stories of other people, what did you learn about family stories that surprised you?
That's a very good question. I learned how profoundly especially young children. I want to go back to the woman who was told she was so good that she never even got off, her playpen mat. I learned that if you tell a child who they are, it may be something that they later want to overcome, or that they know that that's who they are believed to be, but it doesn't fit. And that's where the ancestors become very important, because they give a way out.
Oh, that's correct. Yeah, that's really interesting. That by being able to draw on that, you can still be you, something fundamentally like, because you can say,
Right.
this is who we are, and yet it allows you to escape the narrative that was created when you were a kid. I'm the middle child of 7, so everybody had a narrative. Who you were
Yeah.
was already decided, and whether or not
Right.
that matters in the outside world isn't as important. But when you come home, like, how can I break the parts of the narrative I don't like? Well, I can be like my Uncle Mike or some, somebody else
Right.
that I can draw from that makes it seem credible or seem realistic to the rest of the family.
And people will refashion. I mean, the last chapter is called Patron Saints, and that is about people, often they are artists, but not always, who refashion their family story, just as this woman who on the playpen mat did. And there was one man I interviewed. He was African American, and he was a really, really talented composer, and he was getting recognition. And I asked him about that, and he went back to his family stories, and he said, first of all, if you are a dearly loved son of your mother, nothing can stop you. And he felt that he had that kind of love from his mother. The second story he told was about his maternal grandfather, and it was a black sheep story. It was about his grandfather, who was a Native American, who would disappear into the woods for periods of time and then come back. The family obviously never knew if he was coming back, when he was coming back. The composer turned that into an inspirational story because his creative work involved a lot of stepping away to wool gather in the most creative way possible. And the result was that he turned that into a story of permission, that just as his grandfather had gone away but had always come back, he could go away and would always come back. And he sort of obliterated the part that the teller of the story did not think that this was a great story. It's sort of like, the story of Little Red Riding Hood. You can tell the story of Little Red Riding Hood from the woodcutter's point of view, or you can tell it from the wolf's point of view. And in one, there's a girl who needs to be saved, and in the other, there's lunch, the girl. So
I remember sitting in my class. I was a sophomore in college. I had this really impactful teacher, Dr. Erica Owens, and we were reading this book, and the question was brought up, like, does it make your family stories feel diminished when so many of them match up to what the book is saying other people's family stories were? And I certainly did not feel that way. To me, so much about being able to understand that there's an archetype that we're living out was really important. And it helped me view my family in a different way, of course. Like, it helped me view what is the purpose that my mother has in what she's doing in telling this story. And then coming to the conclusion that really the stories that my mom and dad are telling, they don't even always know the lesson that's embedded in that story. It's just something they have to pass down. It feels right to pass down.
Right. And children are the perfect audience for that because, Piaget would tell you children don't abstract. They don't think in abstractions. They're very, very concrete, and they model what they get. And so it really is strategically very smart, if completely unconscious, to tell children's stories. And many stories, of course, do have a moral at the end. And that's why you shouldn't, talk to foxes. but very often there's not that much of a hammer to it. But it is the way that families pass along archetypes, which is definitely. And I mean, there are very often stories of lost fortunes, stories of love at first sight, but there are variants on that. For example, some families have stories about how you're not allowed to get sick. Other families have stories about the only good child is the sick child, and I imagine those might be Munchausen families. So that you really, there are fine points, and if you tell, I bet if you were to tell one of your family stories that you heard as a child in a room full of your siblings and an outsider or two, your siblings would absolutely know the meaning of the story, and the outsiders would say, huh? Because
I discovered this live on a stage one time. I was asked to come talk about it, and I was like, well, I'm not going to tell stories I've heard in legacy interviews. I'll just pull a story out that I know so well that I can just tell it. And I get all the way close to the punchline, and I realize, like, these people aren't going to understand the punchline. This is like deeply embedded into my family. I've since like worked on the story and figured out what other details do people need to have, or how do I explain it. But like I've now said it many times, like the punchline of so many family stories are, and that's why our family always took sticks of butter out when we ate corn on the front porch. And you're like, what could that possibly mean? But to them, the moral was embedded in it. And it's like, almost a riddle that can only be answered by the family.
It reminds me of a story that I came across just this morning that I hadn't really thought of. And it was a family with a very feisty mother and a very feisty father, and there were power struggles between them. And the father felt that money had to be saved, and the mother wasn't opposed to this, but there was one day where the father went out and bought a new set of golf clubs. And the mother said to herself, oh, yeah? And she went out that very day and she bought a whole set of dishes that she'd always wanted to have. And in the family, those dishes, can you guess? Can you see the punchline roaring at you? Were called the golf dishes. And it was, the way it was explained to me by the children, now adults, was that it was a story of a power struggle that resulted in power equity. And that's why the golf dishes was a reminder of the circumstances under which the dishes had been purchased. And the point there was the mother was not going to be subordinate to the father.
Yeah, and every daughter that hears that story that then later grows up to get married, that's going to influence who she chooses as a mate. That's going to influence how she behaves in that situation, because this is how we behave. Or, I mean, and it's so, once you hear these things, that's why your book was so impactful on me, was that once you hear this, all of a sudden you start realizing like how important the narrative is in your life to making those decisions. The story that I told on stage, we'll see if I can do any better now, was that I had a great uncle that was a priest. And he was a tough guy. He used to challenge us on our Gaelic. We'd see him once a month, and he'd expect that we'd moved our Gaelic language forward, which we hadn't.
Really?
But this was a big, important part of the family, was that everybody spoke Gaelic because they were Irish, and they'd been in the country for many years. Well, one day he was in a Catholic school run by Italians, and they were learning Latin. And somehow the Latin teacher said something very dismissive about Gaelic, how it was just like a dialect of English and it wasn't a real language. And William started pushing back and saying, no, that's not true. It's its own language. And the teacher kicked him out, and the principal then sent him home. So William is sitting at home, and his dad comes home from the factory, and he's like, what are you doing home? And he tells him the story, and his dad drags him all the way back to school, and he grabbed a little grammar book on the way out the door, and he puts the grammar book down on the table of the principal's office, and he says, if there is one word of English in that book, Liam here will eat the book. And this used to just make us roar with laughter, because William would say, well, I knew there was one word that was similar to an English where it was a cognate and it wasn't the same. And so like to us, this story was about, if you have truth on your side, you can stand up and the family will stand up for you. And like, I actually am getting even a little bit emotional about it, but that has lived out in our family so many times that I now understand there's no better way to communicate. The family will stand up to for truth, even in the face of power. And it's been really important to us.
Right. And that story is terrific for a bunch of reasons. First of all, there's a slight ethnic tension in it, right? Second of all, historically, I know this from, I've taught in a Jesuit college for, a long time. And I'm very, very aware that Italian Catholics did not tend to go to Catholic school because there was the Irish clergy who had preceded them in immigration terms. The Irish came, for the most part, in the middle to late 19th century, and the Italians, they began to come in the late 1880s, 1890, and came till about 1910. So they were my family. Now, my family did not have a single priest in it that I ever heard of, except for the padre who was telling but he wasn't a relative.
I can't even tell you how elated I am. I'm telling Elizabeth Stone my story about my, great uncle Father Bill was his name. And you're totally right. Like, all the stories about great uncle Father Bill were this, he was a giant of a man, but definitely like a black sheep in a way. It's just very different. And that ethnic tension that you talked about later, one of his stories that like showed how great he was that the bishop was punishing him at one point for speaking out, and he put him in an Italian parish, and he had to go to an Italian town and be the Catholic priest there. And he won them over because he played soccer with the kids, and everybody could have this shared language around being Catholic and playing soccer, and how they developed into the community. And so it's very insightful that you picked up on the ethnic tension, because when I was growing up, that tension had to be explained to us. I didn't know that existed.
Yeah, right. The other thing, both stories have very positive responses to speaking up.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say that is me to a T. That is 100% me. And I'm not sure that my siblings would say these are the most important family stories, which is another interesting concept of, like, you pick up on the stories and pass them down to your children that mattered to you, and then they pick up the stories that you told, which ones that'll be important to them.
Right. And are both you and your wife storytellers? And do you share?
No, my wife is absolutely not a storyteller. She's an engineer, and now she's a physical therapist. But I'm traditionally, I always say that I'm from Venus and she's from Mars, because we're so different in that way.
And that's interesting, because usually the women are the storytellers. Usually, not always, because when they are from Venus, they're storytellers.
You were the perfect.
Interesting.
Go ahead.
The thing that's interesting about that is you have these passionate Italians who are named O'Brien because they identify with their mothers and their mothers' stories, and they feel Italian, but their last name is not Italian. And that I came across quite often.
So you're the perfect person to ask this. I started to write a blog about this one time, but I haven't formulated the idea so well in my mind. But what you're saying really matches, is that when people come in as couples to do legacy interviews, it feels like the woman is the protector of the stories. So like oftentimes if her husband is telling the story, she'll be like, don't forget this detail. And even if it's not her story, right? Even if it's of his family. And I always kind of felt like, I didn't want to describe them as the PR agents, right? But they definitely have like a feel of making sure the story is communicating the lesson that's important. I don't mean it disparaging in any way. I've just never understood why they're the ones that usually do it.
Well, the interesting thing is that, I'm having about six thoughts, but in Lincoln's day, there was a magazine called Godey's Ladies Journal, something like that. And it was for women. And the idea was educate a woman and you educate a family. And so the women are very often the glue. I saw a headline in the Atlantic this week. I didn't read it, but it said, don't confuse dad parenting with parenting, something like that. And I think that there is a difference between the way fathers parent and the way mothers parent. But in Irish families, the Irish really, I don't like to operate in ethnic stereotypes, but the one I've consented to is the Irish really are storytellers. They really are, and they do it extraordinarily well.
Oh, my mother is so much more willing. We wouldn't know very, very many stories from my dad's side at all, if not for my mother. And having her be the person that listened to my dad's mom tell stories. I mean, my dad will occasionally tell a story, but it's my mother, and she's indiscriminate. Sometimes she's telling stories about herself and sometimes about my dad, but definitely the storyteller in the family.
And that's, I mean, the thing is, how do you make a family? You know, how do you turn water into blood? And shared narratives. I mean, nation states have, I mean, we have our family story, you know, and we enlarge. I mean, Martin Luther King got into it about 10 years ago. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln are in it. The idea, Santa Claus is in it. The idea is that stories bind people together, whether in a nation or in a family. And there was one woman I interviewed, and she said, we don't really have a lot of stories. She said, but if they were going to make a family sort of symbol of us, it would be a bunch of people who were blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and good-looking. She said, that's our family motto, that we're all blonde, blue-eyed, and good-looking. And that was there. But it was something that connected them.
So you mentioned that you're at Fordham. So you're a professor. You're teaching students these days right now?
Yes, I am. I'm on leave this semester. What I'm doing now is I'm edging out, but I have an agreement with them that I teach in the fall and I don't teach in the spring. So I do teach the literature of immigration, and I do teach memoir. So
you were not a genealogy teacher. You were a writing teacher then.
Oh yeah, I teach creative writing. I teach memoir writing.
How do you teach memoir writing? How does somebody learn how to write a memoir?
What I did last semester, and I don't know whether it was a good idea or not, but I asked my students to read Tara Westover's Educated, which is a very long story of a woman from a survivalist Mormon family, very large survivalist Mormon family, and she lived in Idaho. And so we read the book, and we looked at what literary techniques she did. We looked at, does she use dialogue? When does she use dialogue? When does she use scene? When does she use flashback? When does she use flash forward? What are the motifs she goes to again and again and again? And the title of her book is Educated, and that is what it's about. I also, in the memoir class, used Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. And he's South African. And at the time that he was born, South Africa was apartheid. And he really he's telling his own family stories to the public. And they are all, at the beginning of each of his stories is some history. And here's what the story means, because very American readers do not really know in any intimate detail the history of apartheid. So students actually didn't know what they were doing. I mean, it was sort of like a blob to begin with. They started out doing writing. I remember the earliest one that I assigned. The story was, what is the story of your birth? And that was a story, in all cases, about them. And then the second one was if you had to write a profile of any member of your family, who would you choose to write a profile about? And those very often, the story about the relationship between that person and the person they chose to write about became what was the kernel of their stories. And a lot of the stories, I mean, these were 18-year-olds, and they were pretty close to their past, so they don't have the kind of trajectory that they will have later on. But they certainly had stories, and the class actually, and this always happens in memoir classes, the class actually bonded incredibly because they knew each other's story. There's just something I happen to have here. One of the things that I use in a class, if I can open this, and maybe I can't, is just a bunch of statements like, make a list of the polarities you live with. What pulls you one way and then the other? Okay, now tell me, what is your strongest weakness? Go. Another one. What will you have to say goodbye to when you die? So, and these are from a book called Writing Down the Bones. And these are prompts which are very, there's kind of like, Rorschach tests. What do you see here? And so this is, but I use it with all my classes now as a way for the first day to tell an introduction about themselves, even if I were teaching, organic chemistry, I wouldn't do it. But I'm always teaching English, and I'm always involved with storytelling. And so this is a way for, the standard first day thing is tell a fun fact about yourself. And then by the end, they all tell their dogs' names. And don't know much more than you did. But this here, I'm saying, write for 10 minutes. And people actually write things that reveal them.
You said so many things that I want to talk about. The first one was just the way that you break down, good writing. And I think like that one of the hardest things about becoming a good writer is paradoxically, you have to be a good reader. You have to read a lot. And then to be able to have somebody go through and point out, I call it pattern spotting, right? If you can spot a pattern of like, oh, this is the way that language works, then all of a sudden, if you can name that thing, like you were naming a whole bunch of storytelling mechanisms that I don't actually know the names of those, but once you have them, and that's a stored idea, that's a meme, right? That's the compression of a really complicated thing, putting it down, and then giving you that tool. I think that's really important. And
when you told the story of your relative who spoke back, to the Italian priest, you had exposition in background, you had dialogue, you delineated the characters well enough, and the punchline, I'll eat that book. You knew what the beginning was and you knew what the end was. And that is sometimes very hard because, we live our lives and some of my students talk about themselves as the central character. I think that's a current meme.
Yeah,
and that's probably
I'm the main character.
Not the right term. Yeah, right. But we don't really live our lives that way, even if we are imagining who's written the score for our main character. And that is problematic for people. Yeah. When they feel the main character thing is a problem for them.
Writing about
especially
your life
when they don't feel confident.
Writing about your life is very, very difficult. Many, many, many people have come in with either the book product where they send you a question every day or every week and you fill it out, or people trying to sit down and write their own biographies. And I think one of the biggest challenges is like, when it's your story, you have to go back in your mind and grab what are the relevant details that I can tell someone. And if you're writing it on paper, you don't have that immediate reaction where is this person losing interest? Are they, engaged? Are they reacting?
Yeah, right.
And so, there's a much smaller number of people that can write their story, I think, than there are people that can tell their story if there's somebody just reacting to it, because it's hard to write without reaction. And so creative writing class, I'm sure, by having other people's reaction probably really helps.
But what you said you did about your own story was, I don't know whether, when you said you knew what the punchline meant and you tried to use it and you had to refine it. I don't know whether you wrote it down as you were refining it or whether you just thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. But the good thing about writing is that you can revise.
That's true.
The bad thing about not writing and just talking is you can't revise.
Yeah, it's the brilliant trade-off between the two. For me, I just tell stories over and over and over and over again, trying to figure out like what is the right way to do it. And this isn't something that I'm like consciously doing. I look back on it and realize I've done it, right? I keep being like, I know this is a funny story. How can I tell this story? I'm going to try with this person and this person. That was another thing that you had said about the way that students connect with one another when they're telling each other their stories. Talk about that, the 18-year-old that's telling their life story and how they get connected to others by telling their life stories.
Usually it's that they all have horrible parents.
That was a gimme.
To be frank. Or that they all have troubled siblings that they have to reckon with. Because they're at this point, they are telling stories about I think, when I think about it, as I sort of go, the prime character, the main character, was always the writer, but it was very often what the writer was reckoning with in another person. Like one student had a sister that she had adored, and the sister was bipolar, it turned out, and that was a struggle for her. Another one was had some essential religious differences, political differences with her mother, and it was about how you arrive at a détente. Another one felt her brother was the golden child and she wasn't, and it was the grandparents. So that a lot of them are writing, exactly about what Erik Erikson talks about in the Stages, which is they're in the middle of identity formation, and they are trying to find out who they are. And I will say that the portraits of the parents, whether they are very, very positive, well, they're never subtle portraits. They're not nuanced. They're because they're archetypes that they're really writing about.
Yeah, and I mean, so much goes into the child-parent relationship, right? In some ways, for many years, the parent is God, and then you're breaking away from that God figure, and you're trying to run away and figure out who am I, and where did they make mistakes, and how culpable are they for those mistakes. And if you find out God made mistakes, right, you're like, what do you mean? You're not allowed
right
to make mistakes.
Right. A bit of just historical truth. Do you know what the prompt is? And it's not a verbal prompt, which sets. Do you know what makes people write their memoirs when they do? Not the coming of age memoirs, because that is a very, that's Great Expectations. That's the arc ends before he really needs to shave, you know what I mean, or just starts to shave. But there's another later memoir which has more to do with accomplishment, and the prompt for that, you want to guess when it is that they most write? After the death of the second parent.
Oh.
Do you have any guess why?
Well, imagine that you feel like an orphan, right? You feel like you're out in the world alone and trying to make sense of it.
I think that's part of it. There's another layer, though, which is the feeling of freedom, which is you are no longer bound by your inherited stories. You now have to become the main character.
Oh, I think that will hit very, very close with a lot of listeners. A lot of the people that listen to this are, living rural lives and farms, and they're very close-knit with their families. but oftentimes because of the way property is and ownership of that property, that until the parents are gone, you're never really fully in control of that. You don't feel totally as the master of your own destiny. There was a really big Twitter thread by a guy named Clint Fisher just the other day talking about hundreds of people responding to him when he told the story of a 53-year-old man who said, I only own my truck and I've just been told I'm going to one day get this farm, but my dad's 75. He's going to maybe live 25 more years. And people trying to wrestle with, did that guy make a mistake by being close to this family? He shouldn't have done that. Or, oh, this is your family. But when that parent ultimately dies, that will be a huge form of liberation for him, even if it comes with massive pain.
Right. And there's a form of psychological cannibalism that also takes place at that point where you then incorporate aspects of the dead parent, the second dead parent usually, that you hadn't before, or you transform something that was bad and then you own it yourself. So that in effect you ingest your parent to some degree, at least the edible parts, and not the. So
I think that's so right. I think that's so deep. And to go back to the point you made earlier about the young people. Their history is so close, and then you get older and you have this other, there's something really important about people telling their stories to be able to go back and look at things in their lives that have been so painful or so difficult. And then when they tell the story about it, now all of a sudden it's not painful. Now all of a sudden it shows, well, because that happened, that's how I met your mother. And now I'm realizing that, or because we went through that bankruptcy, we made this transformation. And I think that that being able to tell those stories is a huge part of people being able to reformulate the story of their lives.
Yeah, right. And that's the gift of retrospection. One of the memoirs I like to teach a lot is called This Boy's Life by Tobias Wolff. And one of the things that Wolff did very deliberately, there's also a movie about it, with Leonardo DiCaprio playing the boy. One of the things about it that Wolff said in an interview that he did on purpose, very often in a memoir, someone will say, blah, 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 but later I realized, so that you have the young narrator, but you also have the presence of the older narrator. And very often people go back and forth. Writers go back and forth between them. They use the older narrator for retrospection or interpretation that little did I know that what I was thinking really was, right? And one of the things that Wolff did very deliberately in his memoir was it's a memoir of a very unhappy boy who loves his mother, but has a bullying, bad stepfather played by, I forget who played him, but what he does, but the guy is a bully. And one of the things that Wolff did on purpose was he never entered the narrative as the retrospective older person looking back. He said he wanted the reader, he didn't want to give the reader the relief of knowing it would all turn out okay, and that the guy who was struggling was now teaching creative writing at Syracuse. He wanted the reader to feel as uncertain as the boy felt, not being able to see the light at the end of the tunnel at all. And so he withheld from the reader any presence of the adult narrator, who was the author.
It's so funny as you're describing these things. It makes me think, I write for myself, but not for other people, but I do a lot of talking and speaking. And one of the techniques that I picked up was I'll tell a story and I'll say, I used to think, I used to think, and then you say something, and then the audience is willing to go along with you because one, they're not now like arguing with you. Do you still think that way? Particularly if it's something that they don't like. And then the other thing is that it gives you a chance to like show the differentiation between those two ideas. And it's like, but I'm sure there must be thousands of those techniques in writing that you've picked up on over the years.
They are the techniques of fiction, but I also think you're talking about something else, which is if your story is very different. I mean, who's your reader? What do you have to do to get your reader? Now, if you're talking, and there are loads and loads of people who are not like you regionally, religiously, ethnically, familially, but you want to be able to engage with all those people. So you have strategies. Maybe you never said them out loud to yourself, but I imagine you have strategies for the greatest engagement possible. And of course, I do as a teacher too. I mean, I know my students are talking about, in a memoir class, I know they're talking about their vulnerabilities. And so I will mention something about myself that's not too vulnerable, or I'll mention something about myself. I won't say when I was 18, but I will say when I was in college, and it gets a little bit harder to do. At first I was the age of their older sister, then their mother, etc. So I'm always working on how to engage. I mean, it's something that that I do, whereas when I write, I may be writing for a more limited audience. I'm not trying to write for everybody.
That thing that you're describing about building a connection with people as they're sharing vulnerability, I call that the law of mutual self-disclosure. And I experience it a lot in these legacy interviews because people will tell you, oh, this is when we lost a child, or this is when we went through. And you realize, like, if you're talking with somebody and you're really getting them to share, oftentimes they will go way beyond the line of what they would have been comfortable with, what they would have thought they would have done. And then they wake up. And that waking up is like, whoa, that person knows a lot more about me than I know about them. And so now I feel uncomfortable. And that's when you have to, I always say, like, it's the only way you can be truly authentic is if you're willing to share with other people what you're asking them to share with you. But I also agree, you don't want it to become about you. So you don't want to share things that are like, oh, you lost a child, let me tell you this other horrifying story. But it has to be some kind of a balance there.
But that is what also works in a classroom, because in a classroom, I know, just because I've taught since the advent of papyrus, that that what you use, that one of the ways you improve your own writing is by what you can suggest to someone else about their writing. And the more, because you can see something in someone else's writing that you can't necessarily see in your own, and then it's really yours. It's not like Professor so-and-so, with the red pencil or the balloon next to the, on the page. And that's where they really do learn, and where they connect, and where their own stories, where they themselves, through sharing their own writing and reacting to other people's writing, their own stories became richer for it. And they revealed things that they, in fact, hadn't known before.
Yeah,
and I think
I think as a teacher, it must make you a better writer to be able to articulate the things that other people are doing, to watch what they do, to see their mistakes, and then be like, to go to your own writing and be like, ooh, I don't want to make that mistake that I just, pointed out in their own writing.
Right.
So you said you've been a teacher since before there was papyrus. Talk a little bit about where students are. I think people living in the rural countryside right now hear all kinds of things about what's going on with college campuses and students. And are students today the same students they were 20, 30 years ago?
Students today are not the same students they were 5 years ago. And that, I think, is due to a number of factors, but largely the pandemic, because they missed out on, the transition from childhood to sane adolescence is a difficult one. And you have to, we're all trained to be perfect children. Nobody really, and you could be trained to be a perfect adolescent on the way to adulthood, except by that point you don't want to listen. You have to have the opportunity with your peers. And a lot of these people missed, kids who are sophomores now college sophomores now, missed out on a lot of high school. They were in their rooms Zooming, and they missed out on a lot of so if you say that to a girl, that's not going to get you so if you dress like this, people will think you're, They didn't have the opportunities for all those hypotheses about growing up that they could correct. And so they're pretty, I would say 3/4 of them are fine, but I would say 1/4 of them are not. You can see it in, first of all, you can see it in the kinds of stories they tell, which aren't inevitable stories. There are stories that didn't have to turn out that way, that you can see that after this kid has a couple of years of therapy, she'll be different. And it's really true. A lot of kids are on medication. A lot of kids are, they're not in good, 75% again are resilient, or at least their academic skills are not hurt. But a lot of people are suffering.
They take
really
your point that like the young years are when you get to practice and the stakes are so much lower, and there's people that are around you that's exactly why you have a 7th grade dance and a high school homecoming and a prom. It's to give people practice to say, okay, this is you getting a shot at it, but we're not totally setting you free, and like get your licks in, right? And then, but if you didn't have that, it would really be hard, right? Because you're now living in a world where your actions have way bigger consequences. And I think that's the other biggest thing about young people today for me. Like, I was so fortunate that I went to college just before cell phones became a big deal. And, whatever you did was going to stay as local as whatever your college campus. It was not going to go further than that.
Yeah.
And the stakes are so much higher for young people today than they ever were for us.
Right. Right. And my sons now, they're grown-ups. They're in their 30s. And their best friends are the kids they met in high school or maybe before. But one son lives in Seattle, and they all have gone on to work for Google and Amazon and, Microsoft. And so they all have a little too much money, and they don't have children yet. And they will say, okay, let's meet in Austin next week, or, oh, let's go to, Puerto Rico for that kind of thing. And these are their best friends.
Yeah.
Still, they have friends from college. Yes. They have not so many from grade school so much, but the friends they met when they were originally trying to figure out who they were and who they identified with and who was like them. That's high school. That really is high school.
But in
sports, it's athletics.
Yeah, you can appreciate that though, because they have so much of a shared narrative, right? Like there's something about that. Like my closest friend, the one, I'm extreme extrovert, so I have a group of probably 20 good friends. But my closest friend is the one that I've known since I was super, super young. And that's because there's so much that goes unsaid between us. He knows the story of my great uncle Father Bill. And, he was around with my parents in the transformation. So it makes sense to me. And I think, but I also, I don't think that's throughout the years. I'm sure it's been different over time. When people would go away to college, they would oftentimes find their intellectual equals, the people that found the same interests as them.
Yeah, I certainly, I was just, sort of like until you're in high school, either you don't have a fingerprint or you don't know what your fingerprint is. But, when I think about it, in middle school, I was one of the editors of my school paper, and I was one of the editors of the literary magazine. And in high school, I sort of began to realize who I was. And because there were the people I hung out with, I said, oh, I'm choosing these people to hang out with. And, we were all people who read T.S. Eliot and, did stuff like that and wrote for the newspaper and wrote for the literary magazine. And guess what? Who I began to think I was in high school, sure. Have I morphed since then? Yeah, a great deal. But that kernel is still very much part of my identity. I became an English teacher and a writer.
Did you grow up knowing you wanted to do that?
I thought I wanted to be a psychologist.
I think you maybe are.
Well, I think that actually there's not, I don't think I could be a psychologist because I think there are things people could do that I would say, oh, really? You did that? And that probably wouldn't be good for my practice. But I think I do. I think I'm pretty good at reading an audience, and I've learned how to I'm much gentler than I used to be in terms of I want people to write well, but I know that I have to give a lot of praise for what they've done right before I can suggest what might improve it. And notice I don't finish the sentence by saying by what they've done wrong. So, but yes, I think I really always knew a lot. Yeah, I certainly know retrospectively there were things I knew as a child that I didn't have the language to say, but I knew. I knew things about people. I knew who was trustworthy. I knew what some foibles were. I knew when someone hurt my feelings, but even if I couldn't say it.
Yeah, I think that you're in an interesting position as somebody that's asking people to write their memoirs or to do creative writing, because it's a certain biopsy into the mind that I think when somebody goes to a therapist, the relationship is about like, hey, help me fix this problem. And so the nature of the relationship changes than if you're saying, hey, I'm just interested in hearing your story. Just tell me your story. And I know there are therapies where that's supposed to be what all it is. It's just talk therapy where the person just talks and the other person just listens. But there's something really important about, and I think the original, therapists were the people that listened to your stories, right? That listened to you talk about what was going on. It seems to me that those are tightly interconnected, and maybe your way might be more effective in many circumstances than even therapy would be.
Except I'm not just listening. There are things I can sometimes see more in someone's story than they see themselves, and so can their peers. It's not useful to encourage someone to go in a direction where they're not comfortable. And I do think that for many people, writing is about discovery. You know who we have to thank for memoir? The Catholic Church. Because the first memoirist was St. Augustine. The Church invented the concept of sin. And in inventing the concept of sin, they gave people access to interiority. Not just your actions, but what governs and informs those actions. What happened, that was good, but it wasn't so good because people wound up feeling awful, although they could go to confession and then feel renewed. But the real split in the road comes when not with Freud, but with William James, who suffered terribly from depression, who wrote The Varieties of the Religious Experience and had a chapter about the sick soul. And what happened with psychology was exploration, but without judgment. And without a certain kind of rescue. It's one thing to say, go to confession and boom, you're pure as the driven snow again. Change is much slower. I bet people, I'm not Catholic, but I imagine that people who do things that they wish they didn't do and don't understand why they do them repeatedly. and they get the sort of lift from confession, and then they go out and do them again. I mean, one of the things that struck me recently was I was listening to someone, a prisoner, talk about how he found Jesus in prison. And there was certainly no priest who was saying, oh, you shouldn't, that was bad, but now say these prayers. What he found was that he could be loved by someone, Jesus. And that the experience of knowing that of being capable of seeing yourself as lovable is a huge achievement that I don't know you can get to with just contrition and repetition of sin.
Yeah.
I mean, this is maybe not where you want to go.
No, this is 100%. This is great. I'm a believer that in a couple of things that you said, one of which was that it's not enough just to confess you're like, hey, this is what's wrong with me and getting it out, but having some feeling that I am still worthy of love allows you to become something different. Because if you're not worthy of love, then you just are dirt and you will never rise above being dirt. And so redemption requires some sort of relationship with the outside world. It's not just yourself.
Yeah. And the feeling of someone that is recognizing you and loving you. I will say that God always does that, but priests have a pretty spotty record.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So when you said that the Catholic Church invented sin, is this a little bit like the discussion we were having before where they spotted something that was going on and by naming it and giving it a name, then other people could see it and understand it? Or do you mean like...
I think it was St. Augustine. St. Augustine is considered, he wrote his memoirs. St. Augustine's memoirs are about his transformation from a sinner who was he was very active with people other than his wife, into someone who became sanctified, but who did it through the discoveries he himself made with, I imagine, the God he imagined as supportive to him. And he did make that transformation. And it's like, and going to therapy is, you don't call it sin, but something that you're very uncomfortable with and unhappy with, but it doesn't carry the judgment. But there is someone there who, if they don't love you, they at least help you, and they're there to help you.
When you know this much about writing and about you've read so many great writers, you teach it, do you find that makes you self-conscious about your own writing in a way that's, unhelpful?
No, for one reason. What you see when you read a page is not what was on the page originally. I mean, the way I think of writing is scribble, 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 and then, but what the reader sees is a straight, neat line from here to there. One of the things that really I discovered, and I discovered it through my own writing, is that the narrator, in the beginning, when you start writing a memoir, the narrator and what I'll call the author are one and the same. But by the end of the first draft, the writer has realized something, has come to some insight, some discovery, because memoirs, like novels, are either about internal change or external change. And the best ones are about, I think, internal change. So what happens is when you go back to revise, you now have the narrator, you have the narrator who's as dumb as they always were on page one. But you have an author who's as smart as they got to be by page 250. And then you have the author's capacity to act as a stage manager, to make the narrator even a little bit dumber than or at least to put in dumb things that the writer thought but didn't say, so that what you have is the narrator arriving finally at where the writer has arrived at the end of the first draft. But it's much more elegantly done. But really, it's been a mess getting there. It's not smooth sailing. So no, I'm involved. I hate writing because it's always a mess.
That is brilliant, and it actually explains so much of the internal turmoil that I have on like when you're trying to create something new, and you're like, I've done it 100 times, and it's easy to remember that the 100 times they came easy, but they didn't. Each one was exactly as you're describing, scribbles and telling stories that, you know, people look at you quizzically and then you get it out. But the part that's really brilliant about what you said is that the author has hindsight and the narrator doesn't. And that's brilliant. That's exactly right.
But I think of them in a memoir as the author and the narrator are one on page one, but when Tobias Wolff said he wasn't going to interfere in this boy's life by showing himself, that doesn't mean that he wasn't there managing the boy behind the scenes to make him ever more desperate, right? So that, I mean, the story starts with him being a sort of young punk who loves his mother, and at the end going off to private school, but still not redeemed. He's still going to mess up. But you don't see the author managing the boy. The boy and the author were one and the same at the beginning, but they aren't at the end. And you don't always know where the beginning is at the beginning. Maybe it actually you have to go a little further back, or maybe you have to start a little later. Because a story, what is a story? You know, our lives are not stories. We have episodes that, you know, the night that I got my appendix out, right? And those are pretty clear, but larger trajectories are not clear.
Yeah, and they never are. And the only time they become clear is with hindsight, when it's just like a map. A map is more about what you're not showing than what you are showing, because you got to shed everything out of it to make it make sense. But like, it's not really what's there.
It's the, you know, I mean, we are helped a little by the fact that we live in a culture where birth is important. The first words are important. School is important. Sports are important. Graduation is important. So we do have some milestones that will, you know, whereas your first hangnail doesn't matter. And, you know, if you learn to darn socks, well, that's nice. But, you know, unless you turn out to be, you know, a designer, who cares? So you have some help, but not, your own story emerges. I don't think people know it. I don't think people, they get to the point where they say it. There's also something else. I suspect you're like me, which is much better on your feet than on the page.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Or it's easier. I don't mean much better. To me, when I think of how I talk, I don't know where I get it from, but it's like rope, a tangled rope coming out, but it comes out in a linear way. Maybe there's not a story there, and I think there isn't, but I don't even write in as orderly a way as I talk.
Well,
and I know that.
I have to wonder, I mean, like, I think that oftentimes teachers, particularly good ones, are getting so many reps at communicating ideas and watching how people react, because you're so close to them, right? An audience of 15 or 20 people in your classroom, and you can look in their eyes and you can watch what's going on. You know, I've been told many, many times, like, we hired you for your speech, but the value we got was when you went to Q&A, right? And like, the Q&A is totally unscripted. It could go in any direction.
Yeah.
But that's when I've taken everything I've learned about the audience while I was giving the talk.
Yeah.
And now I'm able to plug that into my answers. And I think teachers, I think really most people are probably better at talking than writing because you put in so many more reps.
I don't know. I mean, what do you get from an audience that is useful to you in the Q&A part?
Oh, so the whole time I'm speaking, there's like the energy, and you can feel like, does this crowd want to laugh? Are they, like laughter is such a big thing. I always talk about like,
yes,
for me,
right.
If you're on stage for more than a minute and a half and you haven't gotten a laugh at the beginning, my talks are not funny,
Yep.
but laughter signifies, do we all agree, right?
It's connection.
We all, yeah. And so
right.
I can figure out like who is there, and kind of there in every room, there's almost a few like lead cows, right? They're the ones that are out kind of determining who's going on.
In a classroom too.
And so you've got you've got to find out who they are, and they could be anywhere in the room. And then you've got to figure out, can I connect with them? And then you've got to figure out pacing. Like, should I be going fast, because this crowd likes the electricity of that? Or should I be going slower because they're, whatever was in front of them or their speed? So for me, all of that figures out this timing that if you asked me to write it down, I probably couldn't do.
Yeah.
But in the moment, then when you get to Q&A, I know what joke's going to play. I know what story that I have loaded up is going to do well. And then it's also the place where I've talked with comedians about this, where this is where you try out new material, but you don't even, it's not like you planned it. It's just like, I have a new idea. This audience and I are getting along. I'm going to try it. So that's for me what I get out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, right. That sounds absolutely right. I am very attentive to knee jiggles.
Oh.
Right? When that bored, I'm not doing well. But I have, there's one problem, and it's really a 21st century problem, which is they take notes on their computer. Oh. And I actually said there was a student who was smiling at the screen. And I said, could you not text during class? And she was embarrassed, and I apologized to her. And I said, and I know who you were texting to, too. And she said, you're right.
There was a boy on the other end of that text message.
Actually, it was her new best friend.
Oh, okay.
Because they didn't know each other. She was texting to the girl who sat right next to her. I mean, it was insane, but she was. When they're smiling at their screen, nobody has notebooks anymore, so they are always on screen. And when they're going like this, they look like they're taking notes, but, who knows? Possibly, probably, you don't know. Yeah. Some teachers don't allow computers in the class.
My signal is very clearly, if people are looking at their phone, then I'm not grabbing attention. But if people are pulling out their phone and taking photographs, so I have slides, and I used to work for a corporation, right? And I figured out very quickly that the more words you put on a slide, the more that legal has to review your slides. So I pioneered this way of doing presentations where there's like 2 words on my slides. So people take photographs of it, and I'm like, there's nothing up there. It's 2 words, right? It's like,
yeah, right, yeah.
So
I mean, you polished, but for you, and I guess for me, what goes on, what I really want to do in a classroom is actually get them talking to each other. I don't want to lecture at all. And I don't want to do, like, you need to do a presentation. What I do is I give them, they have to write, 10 reader responses during the course of the semester. I have to get up at a god-awful hour in the morning to read them. And that's what I build the class around, the questions or observations. And that's how I best generate conversation. And that works. But I mean, we're really after the same thing, that some kind of connection with the audience and in some way, how to do it.
Well, so this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. What are you working on now? What are you focused on?
Well, I just did a piece on a man who came from Haiti, enslaved, when Toussaint Louverture was in the throes of freeing the slaves in Haiti, settled in New York. Both the owners died quickly and went broke. He was trained to be a hairdresser because they thought that they would be eventually going back to Haiti, and so he was born in 1781, died in 1853. Cardinal O'Connor discovered him in 1990 something. So I wrote this obituary and he's on his way to sainthood. He was made a venerable in 1997 by Pope John Paul II. But there is no North American saint of color yet. And so this guy, but it was a lifespan. I had to cover his life and his death from 1781 to 1997. So that's what I was working on. And then I've also just finished the screen treatment because I've been doing a lot of work on someone you never heard of named Georgina Schuyler, who is the great-granddaughter of Alexander Hamilton, and was responsible for putting Emma Lazarus's poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses," in the Statue of Liberty. And there's a whole backstory to that. So you can see that that's not as enthralling as family stories, except for the fact that she really learned the progressivism that started with Alexander Hamilton and that her whole family did. But the movie if the movie goes, that will be interesting.
Well, I would have you on to talk about the movie.
Terrible note to end on.
Or anything else, right? This has been a wonderful conversation. If people wanted to...
I've enjoyed it.
If people wanted to read your stuff, is there anywhere you would send them to go, or just Google search your name?
Sure. If you go to elizabethstone.website, you will find far more than you're interested in reading.
Well, they always warn you not to meet your heroes, but I did it today, and this has been a great experience. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
I've enjoyed it, Vance, and go forward and get more stories.